Hi, my name is Elly. My pronouns are she, her. I was a hardcore Christian for most of my life, and now I'm not. And I've started this channel to talk about that, about my upbringing in evangelical Christian fundamentalism, and about my faith deconstruction. I just need you to know right at the beginning that for all those years of my hardcore Christianity, I never dreamed that I would be at this place. I never thought that I would ever not be a Christian. My first memory is saying the sinner's prayer. If you don't have an evangelical background, you might not know the sinner's prayer is the prayer that you say to become a Christian. It goes something like, "Dear Jesus, I know I'm a sinner. I know you're the only one who can save me. Please come into my life." See, it's been a while, but I'll go to heaven when I die, basically, is what the prayer is saying. It's kind of like the most important prayer that you can pray as an evangelical Christian. And that's my first memory, that I was probably 3. So I have no childhood memories without Jesus in them. He was everywhere. He was in me. He was all around me. He was my everything. He was such a big part of my life. In elementary school, I spent 4 years at a very strict Anglican school where we would, wear uniforms and go to chapel and do a lot of chanting. But other than that, I was homeschooled, and the purpose of that, at least as far as my parents were concerned, was to keep me isolated from the world. We had a very small social sphere, and everyone we knew were also evangelical Christians. Honestly, most of them were also homeschooled. I didn't have access to the internet until I was 17. I was only allowed to listen to Christian music that my mom had approved, and could only read Christian books. And even if it was Christian, my mom would still have to approve it first to make sure that it was the right kind of Christian. That was so important to my parents and to my family growing up, being the right kind of Christian. And the funny thing is, that changed over the years. I cannot tell you how many different denominations of churches that we would go through phases of. And, my dad would always have these new revelations of this is actually really the, how to please God. And he called himself a prophet. He said that he had the gift of prophecy, and so our family was like a little cult in itself. Sometimes we wouldn't go to church, and my dad would just be the pastor for the day. Well, he was kind of the pastor every day in our house, but he would lead a 2-hour church service in our living room for me, my mom, my 2 younger siblings, and himself. There was a lot of abuse happening in my household, and unfortunately, our worldview complemented that abuse. The two worked together to create a very chaotic upbringing. And it definitely wasn't all bad, but it has created a lot of lasting religious trauma for me. I have now been in therapy for a couple of years. I have a PTSD diagnosis, and I'm still processing everything that I went through growing up this way. And I think I'll be processing it for a really long time. The way that my deconstruction first started was after I got married to my husband. I got married really young, and that also had to do with both our worldview and the abuse that was going on at home. I was married as a 21-year-old, and when I was 23, I started reading blogs. At the time I didn't really have a word for these bloggers, but they fit into the progressive Christian category. And so I was starting to learn all these different ways of approaching Christianity that I had never heard of before. They were talking about gender roles, about women being able to lead in church, and about mutual submission in a marriage between a man and a woman, instead of the man being the authority and the woman having to obey and submit to her husband. And my daughter, who is 7 now, but she was 1 at the time, I was starting to think, well, maybe I don't actually have to homeschool her. Up until that point, I was fully planning to homeschool her, not because I wanted to, but because that's what I was taught was the only thing that was okay for a Christian. So that was really freeing. And then that made me think, well, maybe I could get a job, and maybe I could go back to school and get a degree. Maybe that's okay for me, even though I'm female. And, from there, I was researching a lot about LGBTQ plus issues. I would have called it homosexuality and the Bible. And so then I started learning, terms like gay affirming. And I started realizing, like, oh, maybe I can be a Christian and not have to love the sin or hate the sin. Maybe being gay is not a sin at all. And then from one of these bloggers, I discovered the term white privilege for the first time. And so then I started learning about systemic racism in America and white supremacy, and how much white supremacy is in evangelical Christianity. And I started kind of looking at my upbringing and recognizing all of the racism. This was all happening within a span of, maybe 6 months or so. And I would say this was kind of more almost like values deconstruction. Obviously there was a lot of theology woven in there, but in October of that year, I had my first real faith crisis. Like the kind where I was like, holy shit, maybe none of this is real. Maybe there's no God. And I wouldn't have said holy shit because I didn't swear back then. But that was basically the feeling of it. My family had just gone to family court to get my mom and my youngest sibling a restraining order to protect them from my dad. And thankfully they were granted that. And the last time I saw my dad was that day. I haven't seen him since then, and so that was in September, and in October of that year was when I had that first faith crisis. And so I definitely feel like the timing of that is really understandable, because my father represented God the Father to me. So when he was out of the picture for the first time, I guess my psyche was finally able to start really questioning. What was at the root of this first faith crisis was I was finally allowing myself to really ask the question that I had been truly struggling with my entire life, which is hell. If God is love, and they always said that he was, why does he send people to hell? And, that started to feel really abusive to me. And I started to see a lot of parallels to the way that I was abused growing up. So after 3 super intense months of a lot of crying and panic attacks and searching scripture and praying desperately for some kind of answer that would give me peace, at the end of that year, in December, I ended up rejecting the doctrine of hell. I just decided that there had to be something more to Christianity and to following Jesus. And that was so liberating and so freeing. And I truly thought at the time that that would stop my deconstruction. I thought that I was finally where I was supposed to be. I thought, yes, okay, I'm a true progressive Christian now. And I'm kind of a Christian universalist too, because forget hell, that's not love. And I can just follow Jesus, but also love other people and fight for social justice. And that I could have my faith and these new values. For the next 3 years, I tried so hard to hold on to my faith, but I just kept having more and more questions. And I started pulling more layers back of how deep the spiritual trauma went for me. I have one of my journals here, and I was going to read a little bit of an entry. It was in April of 2017. Am I still a Christian? Do I believe in any of it anymore? I've been asking those questions a lot lately. Today, I realized that in the story of original sin in Genesis, knowledge is what brought suffering to the earth. How messed up is that? I worry that I'll just keep deconstructing until there's nothing left. There's still Jesus, though. I always come back to Jesus. That is what ended up happening. I did keep deconstructing until there was nothing left. And as much as I wanted so desperately to always come back to Jesus, I just couldn't. I had to eventually admit to myself that I wasn't a Christian anymore. I described it to a friend one time as the line is dead. I didn't feel anything from God anymore in my heart, in my spirit. It was just like nothing. There was nothing there. It's kind of hard to describe when you have this spiritual construct that you've never been apart from, that you've always had since you were born. And this way of interacting with something that feels so real, and then it's just gone. There's nothing you can do to make it come back. Jesus was such a friend to me. God was less of a friend. He was more like someone I felt like, God the Father was always there, disappointed in me, looking down on me, and I could never live up to his standards, or make him happy. But Jesus was so loving and so kind, and he was playful. Like, I would have these inside jokes with him. Anytime I was lonely, he was there. Anytime I was in so much pain, he would comfort me. Going through all of the childhood abuse that I went through and dealing with all the chaos of my family, Jesus is absolutely what got me through. And so getting to a point where I couldn't feel him anymore, and I just couldn't believe in him anymore, was so painful. I could pretend, and I could still call myself a Christian and just try to believe, but there was so much fear. Fear was used to control so much, to control me, to control people around me. I was taught to use fear to control others. I just decided somewhere along the way of my deconstruction that I was not going to force myself to believe anything out of fear. To this day, I still really love this Bible verse that says, "There is no fear in love." I would just tell myself, if God is love and there is no fear in love, then God wouldn't want you to force yourself to believe something out of fear. And so, ironically, or paradoxically, it was a Bible verse that led me out of Christianity. And I'm really grateful for that verse and that idea that there is no fear in love, because I'm still really full of fear. There's so much that I need to keep unlearning and deprogramming from my upbringing and all of the messages that were constantly drilled into me. Over the last couple of years, I've been listening to and reading a lot of stories of people who have gone through similar exits from evangelical Christianity, whether it's a shift to a different spiritual expression or ending up like me without faith. And listening to and hearing those stories has been so healing. One of the podcasts that has meant so much to me is Exvangelical by Blake Chastain. Recently, I've been listening to White Homework by Tori Williams Douglas. She and her sister both grew up in evangelical Christianity and were also homeschooled. I've also read You Are Your Own by Jamie Lee Finch, and that was super affirming to me. And so I've been listening to these stories and I've wanted to join the conversation, but I just didn't feel ready until now. I think the emotions were just so raw. I was so full of anger that I didn't feel like I could really articulate what I wanted to say. I'm grateful that I'm ready to start sharing now. Thank you for watching.